Do you miss your grandmother?
I do actually, yeah, I do miss my grandmother. And my grandfather, particularly being in Windsor. For me, Windsor is hers. Sometimes I'd come round and have a bit of tea with her because she had the best teas ever, so I used to get well fed.
On February 3, 2026, Buckingham Palace released a quiet two-paragraph statement that detonated like a depth charge inside royal households and legal chambers across Britain. Prince William had been named sole beneficiary of one of the most secretive, historically significant private estates in the monarchy's entire history. Not Sandringham, not Balmoral, not Windsor, something older, something hidden, something Queen Elizabeth II had been protecting for years. When Camilla and her son Tom discovered what had been transferred and what had been deliberately kept from them, the fury inside palace walls was unlike anything staff had witnessed in a generation. This is the story of every estate, every clause, every confrontation. From the Queen's handwritten covenants to Tom Parker B.'s collapsed commercial schemes to the moment Camilla stood silently watching William sign away her ambitions forever. This isn't just an inheritance story. It's Queen Elizabeth II's final, unanswerable chess move. The Cedar Estate, a secret older than most memories. Let's begin where this story truly begins. Not in 2026, but in 1944, during the darkest chapter of the Second World War, King George V, faced with the existential uncertainty of wartime Britain, quietly purchased an estate tucked deep within the Chiltern Hills, straddling the border between Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. It was called the Cedar Estate, and from the moment of its acquisition, it was designed to disappear. No royal registry listing, no public media report, no ceremonial acknowledgement. For over 8 decades, the Cedar Estate existed only in the whispered conversations of senior courtiers, a shadow property known to almost nobody, protected by everyone who did know. And here is the first question you should be sitting with. Why would the royal family maintain a secret estate for 80 years? What was inside it that demanded that level of concealment? The answer arrived in the internal briefing notes shared with members of the Royal Correspondent Guild on the morning of February 3, 2026. What those notes described left even the most seasoned royal historians momentarily speechless. The Cedar Estate contains a private chapel with an engraved memorial vault listing royal family members who served in armed conflict, archival vaults housing 186 oak chests filled with personal wartime correspondence and confidential royal communications, 72 previously undisclosed royal portraits, including never-before-seen oil paintings of King George V, VI and Princess Margaret, and perhaps most extraordinary of all, 14 sealed audio recordings of Queen Elizabeth II in private dialogue with Winston Churchill, Nelson Mandela, Ronald Reagan, and Charles de Gaulle. One archivist who had spent decades working within the royal archives described the collection in a single unforgettable phrase. This was not, he said, a museum of history. It was the raw, unfiltered architecture of royal memory, a window into the private soul of the monarchy itself. Now, here is what makes this even more significant. Between 2017 and 2021, Prince William had been quietly visiting the Cedar Estate on private weekends, not as a tourist, not as a ceremonial guest. He walked the cedar groves with the Queen. He reviewed wartime correspondence. He personally catalogued naval dispatches. He refiled hundreds of letters from Second World War soldiers. He even repaired moisture control systems in the archival chambers. This was not duty by appearance. This was stewardship by conviction. And Queen Elizabeth noticed in a handwritten annotation found within the Covenant Trust. She wrote these words: "He will inherit more than the crown. He will inherit the silence that preserved it." Those words were not accidental. They were a declaration. The Covenant Trust, a legal fortress built in secret, does not fall under the Crown Estate or Duchy of Cornwall. Instead, it exists under a private legal mechanism created in 2020, filed under Charter Seal 0142, witnessed by the Queen's personal solicitor, a constitutional advisor, and a Royal Archives notary. The trust came with a delayed activation clause triggered only after 2 conditions: the Queen's state funeral and William being recognized as heir to institutional responsibility. Both conditions were met. The official statement confirmed that the Cedar Estate would pass in full and exclusive guardianship to Prince William effective immediately. But not everyone accepted this quietly. Camilla and Tom had long been working behind the scenes. Camilla pushed a Windsor Cultural Legacy Center idea, while Tom saw commercial potential. Michelin dining, branded food lines, luxury hospitality, and elite tourism wrapped in royal heritage. Leaked documents revealed attempts to reclassify parts of the estate under public heritage law, which would have weakened William's control. Camilla's private events and donor meetings were described by insiders as a trial run for shared commercial stewardship. William refused all involvement and activated the Covenant Trust. The confrontation expanded beyond Cedar Estate into Northacre Hall, Clarence Hill, Greystone Downs, Green Heath, and Oakage Estate. Each property carried Queen Elizabeth's hidden legal safeguards, handwritten directives, and sealed clauses designed to prevent commercial exploitation. Northacre Hall was secretly reclassified before her death to ensure private transfer to William. Clarence Hill was declared a moral sanctuary immune from commercial conversion. Greystone Downs was protected from any branding or transformation. Green Heath carried a hidden £37 million trust and was designated for education and environmental stewardship. Oakage Estate contained the final clause, belongs not to power, but to patience. Camilla and Tom's attempts to reframe or commercialize these estates were repeatedly blocked by sealed wills, anticipatory clauses, and legal frameworks designed decades in advance. Each challenge failed before it could fully materialize. By February 2026, William's position was fully secured not through confrontation, but through a legal architecture built silently by Queen Elizabeth II over decades. Part 6. What this all means and why it matters. Step back for a moment and consider what Queen Elizabeth II actually achieved across these transfers. She did not simply leave properties to her grandson. She built a legal fortress around him, layer by layer, estate by estate, clause by clause, designed to withstand every challenge that ambition, commerce, and family rivalry could throw at it. She anticipated the commercial proposals. She anticipated the legal maneuvering. She anticipated the public pressure campaigns. She built in responses to all of them years before they happened, from a woman in her 90s who never stopped thinking several moves ahead. And ask yourself the question that sits at the heart of all of this. Why did the Queen feel this level of protection was necessary? The answer is not flattering for those who forced her hand. The answer is that within her own family, within the institution she had given her entire life to, she identified actors whose priorities were not legacy, not service, and not the welfare of the monarchy's future. They were commercial. They were personal. They were about brand building and financial positioning and the transformation of 7 centuries of royal heritage into a hospitality portfolio. Elizabeth chose William precisely because she saw in him what those others lacked. Not ambition, not the desire for profit or public platform, but the willingness to quietly catalog wartime letters in an archival chamber, to repair moisture controls in a vault that no camera would ever film, to walk the cedar groves with an elderly queen and listen more than he spoke. Stewardship. That was the word she inscribed into every covenant, and it was not, she understood, a common quality. William's response to every attempt to circumvent the Queen's wishes has been consistent, composed, and entirely in keeping with the woman who chose him. He did not escalate publicly. He did not give press conferences or issue statements of outrage. He signed charters. He walked with his children. He let the legal architecture his grandmother built speak on his behalf, and it spoke very loudly indeed. As morning broke over Windsor Great Park on February 3, 2026, and pale sunlight spilled across frost-kissed hedge, a new chapter of royal history had already been written, not in ceremony or proclamation, but in the quiet, irrevocable language of sealed trusts, notarized cottles, and a grandmother's handwritten certainty. Prince William walked the pathways of an estate that was now fully and finally his own. George bounced alongside him, full of questions about chapels and hidden groves and the meaning of history. Charlotte clutched a leather-bound journal, absorbing every detail. And William answered each question with the patience of a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, what it means to be entrusted with something precious. Camilla's ambitions were not merely defeated. They were rendered structurally impossible. Not by confrontation, not by palace politics, but by the preemptive legal genius of a sovereign who had spent decades watching, assessing, and preparing. Part 7. Camilla's ambitions were not merely defeated. They were rendered structurally impossible. Not by confrontation, not by palace politics, but by the preemptive legal genius of a sovereign who had spent decades watching, assessing, and preparing. Across every estate, the pattern was the same. What looked like inheritance on the surface was, in reality, a controlled architecture of succession. Each property carried its own invisible logic, trusts that activated only under specific conditions, clauses that neutralized commercial reinterpretation, and legal language designed to outlive every individual who might attempt to bend it. By the time the final transfers were executed, there was no space left for reinterpretation. No loophole, no ambiguity, no room for influence campaigns or private negotiations. Everything had already been accounted for in advance, written at a time when most of the players in this story had not even considered their future roles within the institution. What made it more decisive was not the wealth itself, but the intention behind it. These estates were never just assets. They were repositories of memory, duty, and identity. They carried wartime correspondence, private archives, and historical records that could not be converted into brands without losing their meaning. And that was precisely why they were protected so aggressively. For William, the outcome was not a victory he sought. It was a responsibility he inherited in its fullest form. Every estate came with its own expectation: preservation over profit, continuity over reinvention, silence over spectacle. It was a role defined not by expansion, but by restraint. Meanwhile, the ripple effect inside the wider royal household was quieter but deeply felt. Senior figures understood immediately what had happened. This was not a redistribution of property. It was a reaffirmation of direction. A statement, delivered through legal structure rather than public declaration, about what the monarchy was meant to preserve going forward. And in that silence, the final message of Elizabeth II became clearer than any speech could have made it. Power, in her understanding, was never about possession. It was about protection of what should not be altered. Part 8. Camilla and Tom, meanwhile, were left facing something far more difficult than public defeat. They were facing irreversibility. Every avenue they had pursued, legal reinterpretation, commercial positioning, heritage reclassification, and private influence networks, had collapsed against structures that were already locked in place long before their plans fully formed. Inside palace circles, there was no celebration of their failure, only a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. The documents that governed the estates were not reactive, they were preventative. They had been written in anticipation of precisely this kind of pressure, where value could be reframed as opportunity and heritage could be repackaged as enterprise. For Tom, the financial implications were immediate. Projects that had once been positioned as future ventures, luxury hospitality concepts, branded food lines, and elite tourism frameworks, lost their foundational assets overnight. Without access to the estates, the entire structure of projected value dissolved. What remained were concepts without ground to stand on. Camilla's position was more personal. Her vision of shared stewardship, presented publicly as cultural preservation, had depended on influence rather than ownership. When that influence failed to translate into legal authority, the entire framework she had been building around legacy and modernization unraveled. Within the institution, King Charles maintained distance from the direct conflict, but his silence was interpreted as alignment with continuity rather than intervention. Princess Anne, however, remained one of the few figures actively engaged with the legal and procedural aftermath, ensuring that every transfer was executed exactly as written, without deviation or reinterpretation. William, for his part, remained consistent in approach. There was no attempt to reshape the narrative, no effort to publicly define winners or losers. The estates were not treated as symbols of triumph, but as obligations to be maintained exactly as they had been intended. And so the story settled into its final shape, not a conflict resolved through confrontation, but a transition completed through structure. What remained was not dispute, but stewardship, quiet, permanent, and deliberately out of reach of reinterpretation. Part 9. As the dust from the Cedar Estate and Northacre Hall transfers began to settle, the wider pattern across the monarchy became unmistakable. Each estate that had once been seen as a potential site of modernization or commercial adaptation had instead been sealed into a framework of preservation, with every attempt at reinterpretation blocked by pre-existing legal intent. Greystone Downs and Green Heath, in particular, became symbols of how absolute that structure had become. Where some saw opportunity for luxury development, the governing documents saw only restriction: environmental education, historical conservation, and controlled access under strict royal oversight. Every proposal that attempted to stretch those boundaries met the same outcome: denial grounded not in opinion, but in clause. Within this environment, William's role crystallized further. He was not acting as a reformer of the estates, nor as an expansion of their value, but as a custodian of their original purpose. The expectation placed upon him was continuity, not transformation. Each estate required preservation of intent as much as preservation of land. Behind closed doors, legal teams working across different branches of the royal framework began to recognize the same truth. The Queen had not simply distributed assets, she had preemptively defined their limits. That definition left no space for reinterpretation without direct violation of the structure she had established. Camilla and Tom's position, in contrast, became increasingly constrained. Not only were their plans blocked, but the very mechanisms required to revisit those decisions had already been neutralized. Appeals, reclassifications, and commercial partnerships all depended on access to leverage that no longer existed within the system. Even within private discussions, the tone shifted from ambition to recognition. What they had once viewed as negotiable heritage had already been converted into fixed legacy. And fixed legacy, by its nature, does not bend to new intent. In the end, the monarchy was not reshaped by conflict, but clarified by it. The boundaries had always been there, they had simply been revealed under pressure. And once revealed, they could no longer be unseen or undone. Part 10. By the time Oakridge Estate came into focus as the final chapter, the entire structure of Queen Elizabeth II's long-term planning was fully visible. This was not a series of isolated inheritance decisions, but a unified system of control over legacy, memory, and institutional direction. Oakridge carried a different weight than the earlier estates. It was not framed as opportunity, nor as cultural expansion. It was framed as continuity itself. The language embedded in its final directives emphasized patience, restraint, and stewardship over any form of reinvention. In that sense, it stood as the purest expression of everything that had been built across all previous transfers. When William formally assumed stewardship, the transition was quiet, procedural, and complete. There was no public framing of victory or loss, only the final activation of instructions that had been waiting to be fulfilled. Even the surrounding legal and administrative systems treated the moment not as a change, but as the completion of a pre-written sequence. For Camilla and Tom, Oakridge represented the closing of any remaining ambiguity. Every possible route, legal, commercial, and political, had already been anticipated and neutralized in earlier instruments. What remained was not negotiation, but acceptance of structure that could no longer be altered. Inside the broader royal household, the significance of this final transfer was understood clearly. It confirmed that Elizabeth II had not relied on tradition alone, but on precision-built legal architecture designed to protect her interpretation of the monarchy long after her lifetime. Nothing had been left to assumption. Nothing had been left open-ended. William's response remained consistent with everything that came before. There was no attempt to redefine the estates or reshape their meaning. Instead, the focus remained on preservation, maintaining what had been entrusted, exactly as it had been designed to exist. And in that final stillness, the full message of the entire structure became clear. This was not about inheritance as possession, but inheritance as responsibility. Not about expansion of power, but preservation of intent. A system designed to outlast personalities, ambitions, and competing visions, leaving only one constant: continuity carried forward through restraint.